the Dawn settlement was extremely successful. It taught these blacks to be craftsmen, to be tradesmen. It also taught them to be proper farmers. But these settlements, these early settlements, faced problems. Reverend Henson was extremely busy going to the United States, going to England to try to get financial assistance, to try to get donations for this Dawn settlement. It was extremely problematic to get funding to support these settlements. These people needed food, they needed clothes, they needed machinery for the factories. Now, it is interesting also in my research, what I have found is that these blacks in the Baptist churches, in the Methodist churches, some in the Presbyterian churches, they faced racism, they faced discrimination, and they faced prejudice. What prejudice am I talking about? It was something which was subtle and it was also blatant. There was segregated pews. There were certain pews in the churches that were designated for blacks. There were also burial plots, certain burial plots that only blacks could be buried there. And it is very sad. It is extremely unfortunate that this was occurring in Christianity. It was occurring in a religion in which preaches brotherliness, friendliness, equality, respect. The blacks endured this racism, they endured this discrimination, and the reason is, first of all, they had no option. It was either they went back into slavery in the United States or they faced this discrimination in Canada. They endured it. These people, these blacks, were so happy, so glad to be out of slavery that they would rather be buried in separate plots and go to churches and go in separate pews. This is the sort of psychological trauma that they experienced in the United States under slavery that made them want to stay in Canada. They were traumatized and they wanted to adjust. These blacks were open-minded, and because they were so open-minded, they were willing to be assimilated. They were willing to be acculturated in this new society, this promised land, this new Jerusalem that held so much hope for them. Now, these all-black settlements, indeed they were segregated, indeed they were alienated from the rest of the population, and this could have contributed for some of the prejudice and some of the mistrust. Now, what I have found out is that the missionaries did not do the bulk of the work. It wasn't just the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, and the Baptists and the Methodists doing this work. They got assistance from other organizations. Organizations which you might want to call today as NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They did not have religious links, but they were groups of people, men and women, who were sympathetic to the plight of the blacks. They did charitable work. They collected food, they collected clothing, and they gave it to the blacks in these settlements. Some of these groups was the Fugitives Union, the Windsor Anti-Slavery Society, the Refugee Home Society, and the Toronto Ladies Association for the Relief of Destitute Colored Fugitives. Now, what I have also found in my research is very interesting. Some of the churches in Canada had links with pro-slavery churches in the United States. For instance, some Presbyterian churches in Canada, they were criticized for having links with the Free Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, which never condoned slavery. There were some churches, the Methodist Episcopal Church in Toronto, which was criticized for having links with a pro-slavery Methodist church in the United States. There were newspapers like the Voice of the Fugitive and Provincial Freeman that were like watchdogs. They were pressure groups ensuring that these links with the pro-slavery churches were broken. They were monitoring the literature that was being brought into Canada. They were ensuring that this prejudice and discrimination was kept at a minimum. Now, why am I talking about this prejudice? Why am I talking about this discrimination? How could we measure it? How could we determine the impact and the effect it had on the blacks? After the Civil War ended in 1865, when President Lincoln freed the slaves, this was a transition. It was a new watershed in American history. No longer was the black man in chains. No longer would he be enslaved. What was the impact on the blacks in Canada? Many blacks in Canada, they felt homesick. They wanted to be returned to their family. So many made that return exodus. They made a return trip back to the United States. Many did not like the cold weather. The winters in Canada were harsher than the United States. So the weather was another factor. And this was another reason why they returned to the United States. And thirdly, and finally, the racism and the discrimination that they faced in Canada gave them an impetus to continue that trek homeward, backward, and this return migration continued. It started as a trickle and it built up, and by 1870 a sizable black community had left Canada and returned to the United States. Some historians believe that 1865 it was a mass exodus, but this is not true. There are some historians who argue that it was a trickle, it was a gradual exodus. Now, one Canadian historian, Robin Winks, he wrote a book, Blacks in Canada. He was very critical, and I would say cynical, of these blacks in religion, these blacks in their churches. He mentioned that these blacks, their religion was really fragments of Protestantism. He talks about them being theologically stagnant. And he had a quote here. I want to read it out. Wing said, and I quote, "The Negroes' churches often lacked intellectual conviction while possessing an abundance of emotion and faith." End of quote. Now, this is particularly true. These blacks in their churches, they were very emotional. They liked their song, they liked their dance, they liked their music. That is why they were attracted particularly to the Baptist and Methodist Christian denominations. But I do not believe that Winks is giving a fair assessment of these blacks. He has to remember these blacks were illiterate. They came deprived, intellectually deprived, emotionally traumatized. In Canada, they were now being exposed to the Bible. They were now learning to read and write. They were, as we would call, novice preachers. They were beginners. You cannot judge these people on criteria in which we judge our present-day preachers and our present-day religion. I think it is an unfair assessment, and I believe that these blacks were very admirable. They erected and built churches. They had missionaries who they invited. These whites were molding these blacks to be future leaders. These blacks served as teachers and preachers, a dual role, a double role. Winks and other historians must realize that these blacks had to do certain things like make sure that they were accountable. They even organized annual conferences. These churches were formed into associations. There was the Baptist Association, the Amherstburg Association, the Elgin Association. And because of this sort of work done by the blacks, this groundwork, these people were pioneers. They were paving the way for future black religious leaders. And I think we need to credit them for that. We need to acknowledge that, and we need to look at it from that perspective. Finally, I want to mention in my closing remarks is that Canada did something very, very creditable for the blacks. Canada was a haven for people who were ostracized, marginalized, alienated. They were despised. Canada provided a refuge for the blacks. And even though these blacks faced racism and discrimination from some whites, we have to remember other immigrant groups in Canada also faced this racism. The Italians who came, the Greeks who came, and other European minorities who came to Canada, they experienced this discrimination. I want to thank you all for listening to me. I'm sorry I cannot attend physically, and maybe next year, God willing, I will be there. Thank you and God bless.